has devoted his life to building relationships benefiting people living with spinal cord injuries for the last 16 years. He started his rewarding career at Spinal Cord Injury Ontario, formerly known as the Canadian Paraplegic Association. In 2001, as a provincial peer support coordinator, Peter has nurtured, grown, and expanded peer support at Spinal Cord Injury Ontario over the last years. In 2008, he continued in the position of the Spinal Cord Injury Networks and Services Manager as a relationship builder working with people with spinal cord injuries, service providers, researchers, and other stakeholders to strengthen planning and delivery of service for Ontarians with spinal cord injuries. Presently, Peter has been enhancing his services to people by working with communities across Ontario to address and resolve systemic barriers that impact the quality of life. His role is Senior Manager, Public Policy, Government Relations, and Executive Director of the Ontario Spinal Cord Injury Solutions Alliance. Karen Campbell, Dr. Campbell is a PhD registered nurse. She is a lecturer for the Masters of Clinical Science in Wound Healing at Western University in London, Ontario. As well, she is an associate scientist at the Lawson Health Research Institute and president-elect on the International Skin Tear Advisory Panel. She has functioned as an advanced practice nurse in wound and skin care and incontinence. Please welcome Peter and Karen.
Thank you, Janet. I just wanted to point out to people that yesterday was World Pressure Injury Prevention Day, so I think it's very fitting that we're having this session today. And I have to give Janet credit for trying to pronounce Peter's last name. I always call him Peter A. I need to see Peter A. So just a little bit about our disclosures. We have no disclosures today. What we're going to be doing this morning, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some technical issues in terms of pressure injuries, so what the etiology is, risk factors, cost, and personal burden. Then, the title is very fitting. It can happen to anyone because it personally happened to my family. So I'm going to share my story, and I've been involved in writing best practice guidelines. Initially with Wounds Canada when it was CAWC, then RNAO, and the Spinal Cord, the Rick Hansen Institute, and so, it's very true, it can happen to anyone. Peter's going to be discussing why pressure injuries are such a serious and preventable health crisis. He's very inspiring, and I think you're going to be enthralled by his presentation, and he's going to share ideas for what we can all do to really move this crisis with various solutions forward. So let's get started. So we all know this is what can happen and this is what we need to prevent, right? So quickly, just a little review on what the etiology of pressure injuries are. We know that prolonged external pressure leads to compression and tension and shear of the skin and underlying tissues. And it's also that's impacted by the amount and the duration of the pressure. So short-term, like short-term with high pressures, or long-term with shorter pressures. And human skin is actually a lot more resistant than the underlying tissues are. And that's why often we see some of these deeper deep tissue pressure injuries, that things are occurring much deeper before we actually can see damage on the skin. The other thing that we know involves with pressure injuries that muscle can actually survive quite long periods of ischemia, and that's been research that's been done with MI patients. But what makes our tissues more vulnerable is the ischemia reperfusion injury that occurs with pressure injuries. And the ischemia reperfusion injuries damage cell through oxidative stress and release of free radicals. And that actually helps to further develop the pressure injury. But it's interesting that that the injury reperfusion injury is only made worse by prolonged pressure. So when you have the combination of the two, it makes things even worse. And so, you know, we all know that things like this can happen, and when we see this happen, it's quite disturbing for all of us. But when you think about stage 2 pressure injuries and more superficial injuries, they're caused by friction plays a bigger role, but we know that friction has a relationship to shear, so that when you've got friction combined with that mechanical stress, you have this synergistic thing that actually results in a much more serious pressure injury. So what are some of the risk factors? So first of all, people need to be bed fast or chair fast. And as well, there also needs to be a reduction in their activity. So bed fast and chair fast, they can't move or turn easily on their own. And those two states are absolutely necessary for a pressure injury to develop. So some of the other risk factors are if you've had a pressure injury or you have a pressure injury, we know you're now at high risk for developing another one. But the other factor is the actual condition of the skin. So I have a nice picture here of someone with very, very, very dry skin. But think of your elderly patient that has thin skin, or a person who maybe has malnutrition or dehydration. So the skin is already put at risk. And then you have them bed fast or chair fast, and you have reduction in their activity level, and you have the perfect storm for the development of a pressure injury. So other things that influence it are perfusion and oxygenation. So, you know, if you have COPD, if you have peripheral vascular disease, a poor nutritional status, increased skin moisture, which impacts the friction, increased body temperature, which impacts the metabolic demand, advanced age, sensory perception. You folks know all of these things. Hematological measures and their general health status, which can cover a broad range of conditions. There was a systematic review that was published in 2009 looking at sort of the personal burden of pressure injuries. And so the researcher discovered that there were three main areas that impacted individuals with pressure injuries. First, the physical impact, so their symptoms, their general health, the cause of it. And often patients will tell you that they sometimes perceive that we as healthcare providers are actually blaming them for this pressure injury developed. You know, you didn't turn enough, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. But also there's the social impact. So, the impact on their relationships. Are they able, to get out and about and see their friends and see their families? The relationship with their healthcare providers, and the relationship with, their kind of community support. There's also a psychological impact, so people can be angry, frustrated, anxious, depressed, what's going to happen to me? And then finally, there can be a financial impact. So a little bit about costing. Chan in 2013 published a study and determined that the monthly cost was around $4,700 Canadian for every individual with a spinal cord injury who has been receiving pressure injury care in Ontario in their community. We don't have tons and tons of great work in terms of Canadian data, but in the US, they found that the median cost for treating a pressure injury was around $27,000. And I want to just tell you my personal story because, this is called It Can Happen to You and It Happened to Me. My husband, we used to call him Mr. Health Nut because he was a marathon runner, always was writing, wanting to eat the right things, and, I have to only drink green tea when I'm like drinking 4 cups of coffee every morning, and He was diagnosed with AML in August of 2015, and he was actually very healthy. We have the best family doctor in the world, and she diagnosed him just because she was extremely thorough. He ended up having to go through 2 rounds of chemo, and the second round of chemo impacted his liver, impacted his renal function, but he went into remission, and I fought and fought and fought, and finally was able to get him a stem cell transplant, which happened on March 17th of 2016. But I called the Ministry of Health every day and advocated and advocated and advocated. So just so you know, that's important to do. This is a nice picture of us before his diagnosis, sitting out in our patio, you know, after he's gone for a run and, you know, trying to eat all the healthy food. After a stem cell transplant, he ended up having to go to the ICU, and this is actually a picture of his bed, and that walk, I'm going to start to cry, that walk down the hall from the transplant unit to the ICU, across the 14th floor, with all this stuff on it, people looking at us, the ICU team with us, it was, you know, pretty stressful, and it's like, how do you close everyone's doors? And I don't want people looking at us, and we're so vulnerable here, and you know, what's going on, what's going to happen? So Neil ended up in the ICU on renal failure, he was in liver failure, he was in heart failure and respiratory failure. He was in a coma and on a respirator. Was I thinking about pressure injuries? All of a sudden, I'm advocating for a stem cell transplant, and then they're telling me my husband has a 5% chance of survival. And so I'm dealing with this horrific personal event and trying to help my daughters deal with this horrific personal event. So honestly, I wasn't thinking about pressure injuries. I was also having to prepare for a family meeting that was going to be happening in a few days. You know, what were our goals of care going to be? Were we going to be wanting aggressive treatment? Were we going to be taking him off the respirator? So he developed pressure injuries in spite, I think, of best practice care. He was just way too sick. And I have to give the nurses credit because they, I think, tried to do everything they could. But I have to tell you that I felt very helpless, but being a wound care person, I got right in there doing all the wound care, and his skin healed. He actually left the ICU and died a few days later on the transplant unit in a room, private room overlooking the healing garden with intact skin. I think I just want to make you all aware that, you know, I never thought it would happen to me, but it can happen to all of you. So I'm going to turn it over to Peter.
Thanks, Karen. Thank you for the opportunity here today to share some perspective around how important the work of what you do here today relates to people with spinal cord injury. I'd like to use some of this time to kind of share with you some perspectives around spinal cord injury, but also to challenge you to think from a systems perspective how we can take the wound care sector and elevate it in a way where it becomes a priority in our healthcare system and a priority in our hospital administration and a priority in our community setting. So before we get into some of that conversation, I first want to give you some background around Spinal Cord Injury Ontario. For those that are not familiar with the organization, we're a not-for-profit organization. We were built from war veterans from the Second World War who came back from the war with spinal cord injuries and didn't want to live the rest of their lives in institutions. So they built this organization to be able to live in the community, be independent, be self-reliant, and live full community lives, just like everybody should in our society. So we provide a holistic round of services, from direct client services, navigation across the province to people who acquire a spinal cord injury, as well as support services, education and awareness, similar to in relation to pressure injuries. We've produced a prevention and treatment of pressure sore guide, which you can download off our website, as well as we do regular OTN webinars and provide education series in relation to pressure injuries to provide some perspective of the important work that's done in this room. So thank you again for the opportunity. Let me share with you a little bit about what that journey of a spinal cord injury actually functions and how important it is in relation to pressure injury prevention. So when a person acquires a spinal cord injury, if you can imagine, it is a very catastrophic situation, particularly if it's a traumatic injury. There's paralysis involved. The spinal cord injury can be severed completely or partially, which creates a lot of autonomic challenges in a person's life. And a person is typically in ICU or in acute care for approximately 2 to 3 weeks, depending how serious the complications are. Now, evidence is suggesting to us that the most critical time for functional recovery after a spinal cord injury is within the first year, and more specifically within the first 3 months. Now, imagine if a person gets a pressure injury in that small window of time. Imagine what their functional recovery would look like if they can't continue therapies, they can't continue to look at the very essence of what they need to do to recover after a spinal cord injury, if they're laid in bed, if they can't go to physio, if they can't go to OT, if they can't practice all these therapies. So imagine how serious it is to prevent and ensure people don't get pressure sores, particularly in the onset of a spinal cord injury. Rehab is typically about 90 days in Ontario. I can't speak for the rest of the province, they vary. But those are the times where you focus on that functional recovery, to be able to be as independent as you possibly can, and work on skills to be able to live in the community. After that 90-day period, you go home and you work with interprofessional teams to maintain and live a normal life, just like everybody else does, but on 4 wheels. But throughout that journey, you are susceptible to many secondary complications. And pressure sores, unfortunately, is one of the largest secondary complications. So pressure injuries is a problem in our sector that needs to be addressed. It's the second largest killer in our population. The largest complication of death in spinal cord injury is cardiovascular disease, and the second killer is pressure sores that are not treated. It is also one of the most preventable conditions. So we recognize that there's things that can be done. There's priorities that can be made. There's administrative best practice that could be implemented to ensure the good work that's done around this room is at the forefront. So we need to think about doing things differently. Next slide, please. So before I get into some personal stories about myself and my journey and how I had to fight to prevent my pressure injuries, I'd like to get a sense of who's in the room so I know I'm speaking to the right audience here. So raise your hand if you're a clinician, if you're a nurse. Oh wow, that's the majority of you. Okay, how about medical doctors? Okay, very good. I don't think pressure sore injury victims, you don't have to be in a wheelchair. I'm just curious to know if you've experienced a pressure injury in this room. Okay.
But my husband.
Very good. CAPS. And wound care companies? Okay. And government officials, decision makers? Okay. That helps me out a little bit. Next slide. Okay, so I had my accident at the age of 17. I got injured from cliff diving in Greece. I saw a few beautiful rock, thought it was a good place to jump off of, checked the water, everything was fine, did a couple dives, everything was fantastic. Went back in the afternoon, didn't bother checking the water, swan dived off the exact same spot, but there was a tide, and I ended up diving 10 feet into 3 feet of water. Thankfully, my hands broke my fall and I ended up somersaulting into the sand and not hitting my chin, or I wouldn't be here telling this story today. So if you can imagine how horrific that experience must have been for my family and what I had to endure, and pressure injuries was the last thing that I was thinking about. I was thinking about how can I walk again, how can I live again, and I depended so much on the, I think 80% of the hands that put up their hands today on ensuring that my skin was taken care of. And if that didn't happen, it would have never crossed my mind that I had to be turned regularly, or that it was such a serious issue to be able to take care of my skin. So thankfully, through the care of the community, I didn't receive a pressure injury in acute care, nor did I in rehab, and I actually was able to progress in my rehabilitation and live independently in the community without any supports. I played a lot of sports. I love to travel, a lot of wear and tear and dressing myself every morning. And one of my biggest challenges is maintaining pressure injuries, preventing pressure injuries in my elbows. So I'm constantly moving, constantly shifting. When I'm getting dressed, I'm constantly on my elbows. I work full time. I'm always out and about. And that balance between when do I stop and actually heal myself and when do I keep going is a very huge mental struggle, right? And sometimes, I push too hard, I get into a situation and I'm in a situation where I can't do things anymore. So finding that balance and finding that sweet spot on when to stop and when you can keep going on living life is I think going to be my lifetime journey. So I wanted to share that story because it gives a little bit of perspective around how pressure injuries happen and how they get so serious and how people can actually die from them, because it's that balance struggle. So how can we make pressure injuries the largest priorities within healthcare system? I have some ideas from what I've learned from my peers, and I'll share some solutions today. So what I've been hearing from my peers and my wound specialists is that we need to capture wounds early as possible. And that education and awareness, not only from the individual, but in the nursing field and in the wound care field is really important. Right time, right place. How do we facilitate a healthcare system where we're actually supporting people at the right place and the right time? And then what I also hear is teams. We heard that in James' conversation earlier, and we continue to hear that, I think, throughout the scope of what we're today. So, do we, in fact, in our healthcare system, create the availability of having a healthcare system where our wound care specialists are working within a team, or are we working in isolation? It's a very interesting question, because from what I gather is we don't have the resources to continue to work in teams everywhere across the community. Resource and funding. Do nurses really have the time among their million of things that they have to do in a day to actually focus on turning people when they need to be turned, or advancing best practices when they need best practice change? Self-management, equipping the individual to be its own advocate will support prevention in very meaningful ways. Because we all know that, we don't want to be laid down. We don't want to be in a sick situation. We want to get on with life. So how do we create some system changes? How do we create some policy changes that enable this room to be able to do the good work that they do and have the funding and resources and support to prevent pressure sores? Because we all know the moment you get a pressure sore, it is one of the largest cost burdens to the healthcare system, because it just delays everything and cascading effects occur and secondary and more secondary complications after the fact. So let's ask ourselves some of these questions. So raise your hand if you think best practice guidelines on pressure injuries in every hospital and every community is enough? Or do we need a comprehensive strategy? So raise your hands if you think it's enough. Nobody. So can you at least agree with me that we need best practice guidelines, but in a more comprehensive strategy? I wish the government was here to see that. Now, here's another question for you. So sometimes in hospitals, to put the administration in priority of creating systems and supports for pressure injuries, sometimes other countries have chosen to create enforcement strategies, meaning that if a person in your hospital gets a pressure injury, the hospital will be penalized, or the community setting will be penalized. Do we think we need that kind of system in our country to ensure people are being prevented with spinal cord injuries? I'm interested to know. Raise your hand if you think we do, and don't raise your hand if you think we need to continue to reward institutions for behavior change. So, hands up if we need an enforcement strategy. Interesting. Hands up if you think that we need to continue to reward institutions and capitalize on best practice and behavior change. So we got a 50-50 split here, guys. This is interesting. And my third question is around public awareness and campaigns. You know, do we need to get into the general public around how important it is to fight for wound care supports and funding? Or do we need to focus on the government? So hands up if we need to take this to the general public. Interesting. And hands up if we had a pot of cash, where would we focus our energy? Should it be on lobbying the government for more resources? So we need a little bit of both. Interesting. Thank you. Can I get the next slide, please? So think about, as you work towards the next couple days here, some of the things that you're going to take away from some of the learnings. You know, would you consider going to a decision maker? Is that something you want to do? And talk about how pressure injuries is really important? Would you consider going to your hospitals or community settings or your environments in your communities and share the knowledge that you're going to use today? Would you be interested in getting more resources around spinal cord injuries and share them in your community? And think about the stories that we heard today already. And would you be willing to share those stories so we can elevate the conversation on the importance of pressure injuries? So that's my reflection I want to leave with you today. And I just want to thank you all for listening to me, and I hope this was valuable. I truly believe together we can do better than we can ever do apart. And if we organize ourselves and mobilize ourselves, we can create the greatest change to create the capacity and support that we need in your industry. Thank you so much for your time.